Have you ever wondered what it felt like to step out into a dark street centuries ago with no street lamps, no cars, no neon signs, nothing but silence and shadows stretching endlessly before you? Today we stroll under lights so constant that we forget how heavy darkness once was. But back then, a single step into a night street was a choice filled with caution, and the fear that something unseen waited just beyond the glow of your lantern. Hello everyone, and welcome. In this history, we'll step into those uneasy nights together. If you enjoy calm journeys into the forgotten side of everyday life, you may gently subscribe so that the next story finds you easily, like a lantern waiting at the end of a shadowy road. Night in a pre-electric town was absolute. When the sun fell, so did certainty. Streets that had been crowded and noisy by day turned silent, almost unrecognizable. Have you ever seen your own neighborhood during a power outage, when even familiar corners seemed strange? Multiply that by every night of the year, and you will have some sense of the world then. The first fear came from visibility, or rather, the lack of it. A person walking alone might carry a lantern or a candle, but the glow reached only a few steps. Beyond it stretched shadow, thick and unpredictable. Every noise seemed magnified. The creak of a shutter, the bark of a distant dog, the flutter of unseen wings. Each sound made the walker wonder, what caused that? Am I being followed? In truth, most nights were empty of danger, but the imagination filled the gaps. And in darkness, the imagination often ran ahead of reality. Streets were rarely smooth. Uneven cobblestones, potholes, discarded barrels, and carts left behind created obstacles. Without wide visibility, each step could lead to a stumble. Have you ever caught your foot on something in dim light and felt your heart leap? For them, that was an ordinary risk. A twisted ankle at night could mean more than pain. It meant vulnerability, stuck in shadows where few passed to help. Then there was the human element. Towns were safer when lit, but many corners remained untouched by flame. A lone walker feared not only the hidden pit in the road, but also the possibility of crossing paths with thieves. Darkness gave cover to mischief. A man could vanish into an alley with barely a trace. Did everyone walking alone meet trouble? Of course not. But the possibility was enough to keep the heart racing. Even animals became more threatening in darkness. Horses startled easily without clear sight. Dogs barked sharply, and the rustle of rats or cats could feel larger than life. Have you ever been surprised by a small sound in the dark and felt it must be something bigger? That was constant in towns before electricity. The thin circle of light did not explain every sound, and what could not be seen often felt far worse than it was. Yet people still walked alone at night when necessary. A messenger sent across town, a worker delayed at the mill, a guard making his rounds. These steps had to be taken. They moved with lanterns swinging, eyes darting, ears straining. The walk itself became an act of courage, not because disaster was certain, but because the mind refused to rest until daylight returned. The most terrifying part was the silence. Daytime towns echoed with life, but nighttime streets fell quiet. A single set of footsteps echoed loudly, almost unnaturally so. Have you ever been in a place so quiet that your own sounds seemed strange? Imagine that with only shadows as companions. Each step seemed doubled, as if someone else walked just behind. The walker turned, saw nothing, and yet could not shake the feeling. And still, despite the fear, life went on. People learned to move carefully, to trust lanterns, to memorize their town by feel. They timed their journeys when the moon was bright. They stayed close to lit paths. They hurried through dark stretches. Fear was part of the night, but it did not stop them entirely. Instead, it taught caution, a caution so deep that walking alone at night was never casual, always deliberate. So why was it so terrifying? Not because of constant danger, but because of constant possibility. Darkness magnified every sound, hid every shape, and left the imagination free to turn ordinary shadows into looming threats. Walking alone at night was not only a journey through streets, it was a journey through fear itself. And this is where our story begins, with one step into shadow, guided only by a fragile flame, in a world where the night belonged not to light, but to imagination. Have you ever noticed how a familiar place changes completely in the dark? A street you walk every day, full of chatter and color, feels entirely different once the sun disappears. That transformation was even sharper centuries ago, when towns had no steady glow of electricity to soften the edges of night. Streets did not simply dim, they became altered worlds. Walking through them alone was like entering a different town entirely, one ruled by shadow, silence, and uncertainty. By day, the marketplace might be crowded, stalls bursting with goods, neighbors greeting each other. But at night, the same space emptied, its outlines melting into darkness. What had been busy and safe became wide and hollow, the echo of footsteps, bouncing too loudly against walls. Have you ever stood in an empty parking lot at night and felt it larger, lonelier than by day? That feeling magnified tenfold was what nighttime streets gave to anyone daring to walk them alone. The first difference was visibility. Lanterns hung at crossroads or mounted on posts gave off small, uneven circles of light. Between them stretched shadows where anything could hide. A lone walker had to step from one pool of glow to the next, heart racing as each circle ended. Did something move in the gap between lanterns? Was that sound just wind against shutters or something more? The questions never stopped. Cobblestones, so familiar in daylight, became traps in the dark. There, uneven surfaces caught shoes, tripped hurried steps. Without full sight, every stone was a hazard. A stumble could send someone sprawling, lantern rolling away, flame flickering out. Imagine the terror of lying in darkness after such a fall, scrambling to relight your only source of safety. For those who walked alone, each step was both necessary and risky. Shadows made the ordinary seem uncanny. A cart left by a stall became a looming figure. A stack of barrels looked like a crouching form. Even a tree, swaying in the night wind, seemed alive. Have you ever mistaken a coat hanging in dim light for a person? That moment of confusion was constant for lone walkers. Their minds, sharpened by fear, often turned objects into threats until lantern glow revealed the truth. Sounds were sharper too. The creak of a shutter, the drip of water, the scrape of a rat, all carried more weight when wrapped in silence. A single bark of a dog felt like a warning. A distant laugh carried eerily, stripped of context. Each noise reminded the walker that they were not entirely alone, even if no figure appeared. The night itself seemed alive with whispers, Animals, small and large, added to unease. Cats darted across alleys, eyes gleaming briefly in lantern light. Horses stopped nervously in stables, reacting to unseen movements. Dogs growled low at strangers passing by. To the lone walker, each sound pressed the question, is something coming closer? More often than not, it was nothing dangerous, but darkness gave every movement extra weight. The emptiness of the streets brought another fear, isolation. By day, help was always near, neighbors, merchants, guards. By night, doors were closed, shutters barred, squares empty. A person in trouble could shout, but would anyone hear? Have you ever felt uneasy in a place where escape routes seemed cut off? That was the truth of nighttime towns. Even the most familiar lanes became lonely, and loneliness bred fear. Yet people still walked them. Messengers carried notes, physicians hurried to patients, bakers went to their ovens before dawn. They had no choice but to move through shadowed streets. Did they grow used to the fear? In a way, yes. They walked quickly, avoided alleys, kept their lanterns high. They memorized routes, knowing where each light stood, where each danger might lurk. Fear became part of the rhythm, a background hum to every step. What made walking alone so terrifying was not constant threat, but constant possibility. The darkness stretched imagination wider than reality. Each corner could hide danger. Each silence could mask footsteps. Each flicker of flame could reveal or conceal something. And so the simple act of crossing town at night became a test of nerves, a journey, not just through streets, but through one's own mind. Have you ever walked somewhere so quiet that your own footsteps seemed louder than they should be? Before electricity, towns fell into a silence so complete after sunset that it could feel unnatural. Streets once busy with carts and voices became hollow, their emptiness pressing on anyone daring to cross them alone. For those who walked at night, it was not just the darkness that unsettled them. It was the quiet that made every sound stand out like a warning. During the day, a creaking shutter or barking dog blended into the hum of life. At night, those same sounds became sharp intrusions. A rat scurrying across stones seemed as loud as a drumbeat. A door closing echoed through the stillness like a sudden shout. Have you ever been awake in the middle of the night, lying still, and found that even the smallest noise made you sit up? That was the constant condition of the lone walker. Their ears worked harder than their eyes, straining for any clue of what lay ahead. The silence was broken most often by footsteps, not always their own. Echoes in narrow streets played tricks on the mind. One step became two became four, until the walker wondered if someone else followed just out of sight. They turned, lantern raised, only to see nothing but empty cobblestones. Still, the sense of being accompanied never fully left. The imagination, fed by silence, created invisible companions that felt more real than shadows themselves. Even the sound of the walker's own lantern unsettled them. The rattle of a handle, the hiss of a flame, the faint drip of melted wax, all became reminders of how thin their safety truly was. That small flame was the only shield between them and the vastness of dark, and when the wind caught it, making it sputter, the silence seemed to lean closer, waiting for the light to fail. Animals added to the unease. Dogs barked at unseen movements, their voices cutting through the night like alarms. Horses shifted restlessly in stables, hooves striking wood in nervous patterns. Owls called from rooftops, their cries echoing across streets. Each sound was ordinary, but in the silence it felt loaded with meaning. Was the dog warning of a stranger? Was the horse spooked by something more than shadows? The walker could never be certain. In some towns, watchmen made rounds calling, the hour to reassure those awake. But these calls were far apart, and in the gaps silence reigned. The walker might hear the call once in the distance, then nothing for what felt like an eternity. The voice reminded them that someone else was awake, but it also emphasized how empty the streets were otherwise. The hours stretched long, marked only by the uneven rhythm of their own steps. Even natural sounds became unsettling. The rustle of wind through alleys, the drip of water from roofs, the clatter of loose shutters, all fed the mind with possibilities. Have you ever mistaken a tree's movement in the dark for something alive? Multiply that by every corner, and you can understand the weight of silence on those who walked alone. The silence carried danger not just of the imagination, but of the body. Without background noise, a stumble or cry could carry far, alerting others. Helpful if aid was near, but perilous if ill-intentioned ears were listening. This made every noise the walker made feel risky. Even the scrape of a shoe seemed to announce them to the night. So many tried to walk quietly, though the silence made quiet walking almost impossible. What made this silence most terrifying was that it sharpened awareness too far. The walker's senses became stretched on edge until every small detail felt larger than life. A sound that by day would pass unnoticed became at night a mystery demanding explanation, and without clear answers the mind filled the silence with fears. So what was the silence of night? It was not peace, but pressure. It pressed on ears, on nerves, on the imagination. It made each flame feel smaller, each shadow feel larger, each step feel heavier. Walking alone at night meant walking through silence as much as through darkness, and that silence was often the most frightening part of all. Have you ever mistaken a shadow for something it wasn't? A coat on a chair becomes a lurking figure. A branch across the wall seems like a reaching hand. Now imagine living in a world where shadows were constant companions every night. For those walking alone centuries ago, shadows were not playful tricks, but serious challenges. They could deceive, distract, and terrify, all while the walker's fragile flame fought to keep them at bay. Lantern light created as much mystery as clarity. Its glow spread in uneven circles, with edges that blurred into sudden blackness. Beyond the circle, shapes waited, half seen and half imagined. A barrel looked like a crouching figure. A post turned into a standing man. Even a dog sleeping in the street could appear monstrous until the walker drew closer. Have you ever felt that relief when a shadow reveals itself as something ordinary? For them, that happened at nearly every turn. Candles in windows added more confusion. Their glow spilled outward, but only faintly, creating long, stretched silhouettes across cobblestones. A shutter swaying in front of a candle might make shadows that leapt like figures moving quickly. A simple flicker could turn stillness into motion. Walkers often quickened their steps in such streets, hearts racing, convinced that someone else had joined them in the dark. Torches were even worse for shadows. Their flames danced wildly, throwing shapes across walls that twisted with every gust of wind. A group of torches in a square might create a chaotic sea of shifting forms. Alone, moving past such scenes could feel like stepping through a crowd of phantoms. Each step meant shapes grew larger, then shrank, then reappeared behind. Even natural light from the moon and stars made the world deceptive. Branches stretched across alleys, bending in the breeze, seemed alive. Tall houses cast deep wells of darkness between them, leaving only slivers of light to outline strange forms. A lone traveler might stop, staring into these voids, waiting for a figure to emerge. Most times nothing happened, but the weight itself was heavy, filled with the possibility that something moved unseen. Water reflected shadows in unsettling ways. A canal or puddle caught torchlight, doubling the shapes and making them ripple as though alive. A person might see their own reflection moving and believe it was someone following. Bridges were especially unnerving. Shadows gathered beneath them, and lanterns above cast warped patterns on the water. Crossing them meant trusting that the movements below were illusions, not threats. The human mind turned shadows into companions, often unwanted ones. Have you ever walked at night and felt sure someone was behind you, only to realize it was your own shadow stretched long? That happened constantly to those before electricity. With every step, their shadow leaned closer, taller, and more ominous, whispering the question, is that me or someone else? Shadows also hid real dangers, which made them harder to dismiss. A thief might crouch in an alley, blending into darkness. A stray dog could emerge suddenly from a pool of shadow. The walker never knew which shapes were tricks and which were truth. This uncertainty made every corner a gamble. Was it safe, or was it a trap? The only answer came with each cautious step forward. For many, the memory of deceptive shadows stayed long after the walk was over. People told stories not only of dangers, but of illusions, the barrel that became a man, the branch that became a figure, the reflection that seemed to follow. These tales spread, reinforcing the idea that night streets were not only dangerous but deceptive. They taught children to fear shadows, not because they always hid threats, but because they always suggested them. So why did shadows terrify so deeply? Because they blurred the line between imagination and reality. In darkness, the eye grasped at outlines, and the mind filled in the rest. A harmless object became a lurking stranger. A simple flicker became pursuit. Walking alone meant living with constant doubt about what was real. And that doubt, fed by shadows, made every journey heavier than the distance itself. Have you ever stepped onto a road at night and felt it stretch longer than it ever did by day? Streets and paths that seemed short in sunlight became endless under darkness. For those walking alone before electricity, this change was not just unsettling, it was dangerous. The emptiness of roads at night carried risks that came from both the world around and the mind within. By day, a road was full of people, carts, and noise. By night, it emptied. Few dared to travel after sunset unless necessary, which meant the lone walker often had no companions, no witnesses, no safety in numbers. Have you ever walked a quiet street late at night and realized you were the only one there? Multiply that by an entire town, and you have the feeling of those who braved old roads alone. The emptiness was itself a warning. A deserted road meant fewer chances of help. A stumble could leave a walker injured with no one to hear their call. A thief could strike with no eyes to watch. Even simple misfortune, like a lantern sputtering out, became perilous when no one else passed to lend a flame. The road became both path and trap, offering passage but demanding caution with every step. Lanterns and torches, where they existed, gave only scattered guidance. Most stretches remained unlit, forcing the walker to rely on moonlight or memory. Have you ever tried to navigate a familiar place in pitch black and found it suddenly unfamiliar? That was the challenge nightly. Streets twisted, alleys looked alike, corners hid more than they revealed. A wrong turn could double the length of a journey, or worse, lead to a place where light never reached. Animals roamed more freely at night. Dogs strayed from yards, sniffing curiously at lone walkers. Horses startled at sudden movements. Even smaller creatures like rats, cats, or owls seemed larger when glimpsed briefly at the edge of a lantern's glow. The road was alive with movement, though often harmless, and yet to the solitary traveler it felt as though the darkness itself had eyes. And then there was the silence, broken only by the walker's own presence. Each footstep echoed too loudly. Each breath sounded sharp. Did someone else hear it? Was someone else following? The mind whispered questions with every sound. A shift of leaves, a rattle of shutters, a crack of wood. All became signals of possibility, most of them imagined, yet none easily ignored. Some tried to comfort themselves with routines, counting steps between lantern posts, whispering to break the silence, or humming softly. Have you ever spoken aloud in the dark just to prove you are not alone? Walkers then did the same, using sound to push back against the void. Yet the void always pressed back, swallowing their voices quickly, leaving them with echoes instead. Of answers, still the road had to be walked. Bakers moved toward ovens before dawn, messengers carried notes, healers crossed town to reach patients. Life did not pause for night, and so people learned strategies. They kept to known routes, hurried their pace, held lanterns high. They taught themselves to read shadows, to ignore harmless noises, to push imagination aside. Fear never left, but caution kept them moving. Even now, as you listen to this story, you may sense that emptiness, the road stretching ahead, your lantern swinging, silence pressing close. And if you would like more of these quiet histories to keep you company, you may gently subscribe so the next walk through the past finds you, just as a flame once found its way through darkness. So what was the danger of the empty road? It was not only what could be found there, but what might be imagined there. Darkness made every possibility feel sharper, every absence feel like a presence, every sound feel like a threat. To walk alone was to walk not just across ground, but across fear itself. Have you ever noticed how comforting a single light can feel in the dark, even if it only reaches a few steps ahead? For those who walked alone centuries ago, their lanterns or candles were companions as much as tools. Yet the circle of light they made was fragile, and the deeper the night, the more fragile it seemed. To walk within it was to feel safe for a moment, but to look beyond was to be reminded how small that safety truly was. A lantern's glow did not banish darkness. It pushed it back just enough to reveal the ground beneath and a little space around. Everything outside that circle remained uncertain. Shadows clung tightly at the edges, shapes half seen but never explained. Have you ever tried walking through a field at night with only a flashlight, noticing how the world vanishes just beyond? The beam? That was the nightly experience of those who walked with flame. The lantern itself required constant care. Flames flickered in wind, sputtered with poor fuel, or dimmed as the wick burned low. A single careless step could tilt it, spilling wax or oil, snuffing the light. Imagine the terror of losing your only flame in the middle of a silent street, your eyes straining to adjust while shadows pressed closer. For walkers, then, protecting the lantern was as important as walking itself. Holding it higher made the circle larger, but also cast longer shadows. A barrel became a crouching figure, a post a tall stranger. Lowering it reduced the range but steadied the flame. Walkers had to balance light and control, adjusting constantly as they moved. The lantern was both shield and deceiver, comfort and trickster. Candles offered even less security. A small flame cupped in the hand gave light only to the next few. Steps. Wax dripped, smoke wavered, and the faint glow did little against deep night. Still, for those who could not afford a proper lantern, a candle was better than nothing. Have you ever used your phone's light in total darkness, noticing how it shows so little yet still feels vital? That was the role of the candle, inadequate but precious. The fragility of flame-shaped behavior. Walkers hunched over lanterns, shielding them with cloaks or hands. They chose routes with less wind, avoided open squares, kept to walls that blocked drafts. When rain fell, the risk grew worse. Water hissed against flame, and lantern glass fogged or cracked. Many carried spares, but even so, each step through rain felt like gambling with blindness. The lantern's glow also betrayed its bearer. A light in the distance told others where someone walked. This could be reassuring. Seeing another lantern ahead meant company, but it could also be unsettling, because the walker could be seen long before they knew who watched. Did people fear being marked by their own light? Sometimes. A lantern gave safety, but it also erased anonymity. To carry it meant to be visible in a world where not all eyes were kind. Yet the light mattered, fragile as it was. Without it, the road was nearly impossible. Holes in cobblestones, carts left behind, sudden corners, all became dangers. The flame's small circle made walking possible, and so people treated it with reverence, not in a sacred way, but in a practical one. They trimmed wicks carefully, polished glass often, tested fuel supplies before setting out. The lantern was survival, and its glow was proof of preparation. And still, the most terrifying part was what lay beyond it. The eye could not stop reaching past the circle, searching the shadows for movement. A tree swaying, a shutter banging, a stray dog crossing. Each appeared suddenly at the edge, then vanished. Walkers often found themselves staring into blackness, convinced something waited just beyond reach. Even when nothing came, the waiting was its own form of fear. So what was the lantern's fragile circle? It was safety and vulnerability in the same breath. It gave confidence to take another step, but reminded at every moment how small that confidence was. Walking alone at night meant carrying light not as a weapon against a darkness, but as a promise that the next step could still be taken. and that fragile promise was often the only thing that kept the walker moving forward. Have you ever walked down a quiet street at night and felt certain that someone was behind you, even when the road was empty? That creeping sensation, half fear and half imagination, was magnified 100 times for people in centuries before. Electricity. Darkness and silence fed the mind until the idea of being followed became one of the most unsettling parts of walking alone. The echo of footsteps was the most common cause. In narrow streets, sound bounced from wall to wall, doubling and distorting. A single step from the walker might return as 2 or 3 echoes, spaced just far enough apart to feel like another set of feet. Have you ever tested an echo and been startled when it didn't return the way you expected? Imagine that happening with every step, every night. A walker's own rhythm became a trickster, convincing them of company they could not see. Lanterns made the feeling worse in some ways. The glow stretched the walker's shadow behind them, long and distorted, moving. As they moved, in the corner of an eye, that shadow seemed like another figure, always following, always near. When they turned, it was gone, revealed as their own. But the mind did not always accept that explanation. It whispered, "What if this time it isn't just a shadow?" The silence of night fed the fear. During the day, background noise masked footsteps. At night, each sound was laid bare. A scrape, a shuffle, the faint tap of something against stone. All stood out. Was it a loose shutter, a rat, or someone else's feet, careful and deliberate? The walker could not be sure, and so the imagination supplied answers, most of them unpleasant. Some carried small habits to break the tension. They paused suddenly, listening to hear if footsteps continued. They turned quickly, lantern held high, scanning the shadows. Most times they found nothing, only empty road. Yet the act of checking gave them brief relief. Have you ever looked behind you just to make sure, even when you knew no one was there? That impulse is timeless. The fear of being followed was not always imagined. The cover of darkness made it easier for others to walk, unseen. Mischief makers, thieves, or simply other late travelers sometimes trailed silently. The walker could never know if the feeling was a trick of the mind or a real presence. That uncertainty was the heart of the terror. It was not the danger itself, but the inability to measure it. Even animals contributed to the unease. A stray dog might pad quietly behind, drawn by curiosity or the hope of scraps. Cats slinked through alleys, their paws soundless, their eyes catching the lantern glow. Horses in distant stables stamped and shifted, adding layers of sound. To a mind already primed for fear, each noise became confirmation. Yes, someone is there. The feeling often lingered after the walk ended. People spoke of reaching home, closing the door, and still sensing footsteps echoing in memory. The silence of the room felt heavy, the imagination unwilling to let go of the companion it had created. They looked from window to street, half expecting to see a figure waiting. The walk ended, but the fear traveled with them. Stories spread about those who truly were followed, adding weight to the fear. A friend claimed to have heard steps for streets before turning to see a stranger vanish. Another swore that a lantern revealed a face at the edge of light before it disappeared. Whether true or exaggerated, such tales lingered, making every night walk more fearful. Have you ever heard a story that stuck with you so strongly that it changed how you felt in the dark? That was how these stories worked, deepening the sense that no one was ever truly alone at night. So why was the fear of being followed so powerful? Because it was never fully answerable. Shadows could be tricks, echoes could be false, noises could be harmless. But sometimes they were not, and the walker never knew which was true until the moment passed. In that uncertainty lay the terror, not of what was there, but of what might be. Walking alone at night meant not only battling the dark and silence, but also the suspicion that company walked just behind, unseen, and whether real or imagined, that suspicion made every step heavier than the last. Have you ever noticed that the darker and quieter a place is, the more your own thoughts grow louder? In towns before electricity, walking alone at night was not just a battle with shadows or silence. It was also a battle with the mind. Loneliness pressed as heavily as darkness, and the walker often felt its weight with each step. By day, a person was surrounded by community. Voices filled the air, faces passed in every direction, familiar landmarks reassured the eyes. At night, those same streets emptied, doors shut tight, shutters closed, windows dark. The walker was left outside the circle of safety, moving through a world where everyone else had vanished. Have you ever entered a space that felt abandoned even though you knew people were nearby? That was the nightly reality of towns without steady light. The loneliness deepened fear because it removed support. If trouble came, there was no one to call to, no one to notice, no one to help. Each corner carried not only uncertainty, but the knowledge that if something happened, it might go unseen. The very emptiness made the road feel hostile, as though absence itself was dangerous. Even the glow of lanterns reinforced the sense of isolation. Their light illuminated only a small circle, reminding the walker of how much darkness surrounded them. That tiny bubble of brightness was personal and fragile, proof that they were the only moving figure in a sea of night. Have you ever stood in a spotlight and felt exposed rather than safe? The lantern was both shield and reminder of solitude. Sounds became companions, though uneasy ones. The shuffle of shoes, the creak of a lantern handle, the rhythm of breathing, all belonged to the walker alone. Without the noise of others, their own presence seemed amplified. Sometimes they hummed softly or muttered words aloud, just to hear another voice, but the silence swallowed their sound quickly, leaving them lonelier than before. Loneliness also gave imagination more power. With no one to reassure them, every doubt grew larger. A shadow stretched across a wall became a figure waiting. The noise in the distance became footsteps. The absence of company meant there was no one to dismiss these fears, no one to say, "It's nothing." Alone, the mind could not resist filling the emptiness with possibilities. Travelers often described the longest walks as those taken alone. Even short distances stretched endlessly without companions. A mile by day felt like 2 at night, and 2 felt like 10. The road seemed to lengthen with each step, as though loneliness itself pulled it farther. Have you ever driven or walked alone and felt time slow, every minute dragging? That was how nights stretched for those with no company. Yet loneliness was not always crushing. For some, it gave space for thought. Bakers walking to ovens before dawn described planning there. Day in the silence. Messengers remembered their routes clearly, no distraction breaking their concentration. Still, even these practical minds admitted that now and then a sound or shadow pulled them back into unease, reminding them that they were truly alone. Stories of lonely walks passed from person to person, making the idea even heavier. People spoke of neighbors who heard their own names whispered in empty alleys, of travelers who felt hands brush their shoulders, though no one was there. Whether believed or not, these tales added to the burden of solitude. They suggested that loneliness was not only emotional, but haunted the streets themselves. So why did loneliness terrify so deeply? Because it magnified everything. It turned shadows into watchers, silence into whispers, distance into endlessness. It reminded the walker that in that moment they stood apart from the rest of the town, exposed in ways they never were by day. Walking alone at night was not only about facing what might be in the dark, it was also about facing oneself, the fears, doubts, and thoughts that grew louder when no one else was near. And that, perhaps, was the heaviest weight of all. Have you ever noticed that when you're alone in the dark, your mind starts telling stories? A faint sound becomes a whisper. A flicker of movement becomes a figure. A simple shadow becomes a threat. For those who walked alone before electricity, imagination was not just a companion, it was an enemy. The longer the walk, the more the mind filled the silence and darkness with things that weren't really there. Every step was accompanied by questions. What was that sound? Who was there? Did something move? Without clear answers, the imagination answered for them, and those answers were rarely comforting. A cat darting across a street became a pursuer. The echo of one's own footsteps became another set of feet, perfectly timed, but always just behind. The sigh of the wind became a warning voice. This constant guessing drained the walker's courage. Have you ever startled at something simple, then laughed at yourself afterward? For them there was little laughter. They could not easily dismiss what they saw or heard, because sometimes the imagination was right. A figure really could emerge from the shadows. A real person could follow. A real danger could hide behind the ordinary. That blend of possibility and imagination was what made night walks unbearable for many. The lantern's flicker made illusions stronger. Shadows stretched, twisted, and leapt. The walker stared into them, convinced they saw movement, and sometimes even believed shapes took form, faces, hands, whole figures. The mind seized these hints, spinning stories in seconds. The darkness did not need to hide real threats. It only needed to suggest them. The imagination did the rest. Silence played its part as well. In total quiet, even a drip of water seemed purposeful. A squeak of wood sounded like a warning. Each noise became a message, though the walker could not read it. Their minds translated every sound into a presence, a hint of company where none existed. Have you ever woken in the night hearing a house settle and been certain someone else was moving? That was nightly reality. Imagination also turned memories into dangers. A tale heard during the day replayed itself in the darkness. Stories of thieves waiting in alleys, travelers robbed on empty roads, mysterious figures seen at crossroads, all resurfaced when the walker was most vulnerable. With Each remembered tale, the night seemed more crowded with unseen watchers. The mind did not only create fear, it created company. Some described feeling as though someone walked beside them, step for step, though no one was there. Others swore they heard voices, faint and low, carried by the wind. These were not real presences, but they felt real enough to quicken steps, to tighten the grip on a lantern, to shorten the road with urgency. And yet, imagination was also a form of survival. By filling the dark with possibilities, it kept walkers alert. They noticed every sound, every flicker, every movement. This readiness sometimes saved them from real dangers. The imagination might have been cruel, but it also prepared them for the truth. Even now, as you listen to this history, you may find your own imagination at work, picturing those empty streets, hearing footsteps in the silence, seeing a lantern's glow against tall shadows. And if you would like more of these calm journeys into forgotten worlds, you may gently subscribe so the next story finds you easily, like a flame waiting at the edge of darkness. So what does imagination teach us about walking alone at night? That the greatest fear was not always what was there, but what might be there. The night was never truly empty, because the mind filled it with figures, sounds, and shapes of its own making, and that invisible company was sometimes more frightening than any real threat could ever be. Have you ever noticed how the world feels completely different once the first hint of morning light appears? No matter how long the night seemed, no matter how heavy the silence or deep the shadows, dawn changes everything in an instant. For those who walked alone centuries ago, the coming of day was not simply a shift in light. It was the lifting of fear itself. The darkest hour was always the one just before sunrise. Flames burned low, lanterns guttered, and the cold pressed hardest. Walkers felt the weight of their journeys most in these moments, when every sound seemed sharper, every shadow more solid. But then, almost unnoticed at first, the sky softened. A gray line appeared on the horizon. The air seemed to breathe differently, carrying not only chill but promise. Have you ever been awake through the night and felt relief when the sky finally began to pale? That was the moment of release for every lonely traveler. As the sun rose, shadows retreated. Figures that had loomed large dissolved into ordinary shapes: barrels, carts, trees, doors. The imagination, which had been so restless in darkness, lost its fuel. Fear ebbed as certainty returned. Streets that had stretched endlessly by night shortened again, their familiar outlines visible. Each step felt lighter, as though the road itself welcomed the walker home. The silence also broke with dawn. Doors creaked open, voices stirred, animals woke. The lone walker was no longer alone. Have you ever been in a place that felt deserted, only to feel comfort when people returned? That was the gift of morning, company restored, even before a word was spoken. The lanterns, which had been so precious, were no longer needed. Flames were snuffed, wicks cooled, smoke drifted upward and vanished in daylight. For hours they had been fragile companions, their glow the only protection against the vast unknown. Now they rested, waiting for another night. The walker carried them home, grateful, but also grateful to set them aside. Dawn was more than safety. It was victory. To make it through the night was to prove endurance. Walking alone, battling silence, facing shadows, resisting imagination, all of it ended with the sun. and with the end came pride, however quiet. People rarely spoke of it openly, but within themselves they knew I made it. The night did not stop me. Communities too felt dawn's relief. Watchmen finished their rounds, bakers lit ovens, market stalls prepared. The world awoke together, and the fears of the night became distant, almost unreal. Stories of footsteps heard or shadows seen lost their sharpness under daylight. But the memory lingered, shaping how people prepared for the next night. So why was dawn so powerful? Because it was certainty after uncertainty, clarity after confusion, warmth after cold. It reminded people that no matter how long or frightening the night, it always ended. Have you ever faced something difficult and found that the simple passage of time brought ease? That was what dawn gave to every traveler. Proof that waiting and enduring would be rewarded. Walking alone at night was terrifying not only because of dangers, but because of doubts about what was real, what was imagined, what might happen in the dark. Dawn answered those doubts without words. It showed that most shadows were only shadows, most sounds only sounds, and that fear itself was often the heaviest burden. And so this history closes where the night always closes, with sunrise. The streets brightened, the voices returned, and the walkers stepped into a world no longer haunted by silence and shadow. Fear lifted with the light, leaving only memory. And that memory, carried through the day, reminded everyone how much courage it once took simply to walk alone at night.